Well, welcome everybody. My name is Kriyan Butler, and I'm the Director of the Global Economy and Finance Program at Chatham House. And it's my really great pleasure to welcome you today to what promises to be a fascinating discussion on deaths of despair, COVID-19, and the future of capitalism. COVID-19 has been an unprecedented economic shock as well as a global health emergency, and it is clear that it will have far-reaching effects. One area where there has been a lot of interest and concern is on how it will affect underlying trends in inequality, both in the short term and in the longer term. This will be the key focus of today's discussion, and there's really no better person to lead us through it than our speaker today, Professor Angus Deaton. Professor Deaton is the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and Economics Department at Princeton University. He is co-author earlier this year with his wife, Professor Ann Case, of Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, which provides deep insights into the causes of rising inequality in the US. And in 2015, he won the Nobel Prize for Economics for his path-breaking work on individual consumption choices. So with that, Professor Deaton, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Kriyan, for that wonderful introduction. Let me just share my screen, and then I think we're ready to go. So let me start with really the second slide. And I'm going to talk about deaths of despair, and I'm going to talk about how deaths of despair feeds into what's happening now, and try to think a little bit about what's going to happen in the future, which of course is always hard. So let me take you into the past. Even before the arrival of the virus, the lives of Americans without a bachelor's degree, which is actually about 2/3 of the population aged 25 to 64, were coming apart in many dimensions. The most notable is that the mortality rates were rising. But it's not mortality, it's morbidity. There's been an epidemic of pain. Social isolation is getting much worse. Loneliness is getting worse. Marriages are failing. Labor force participation has been falling for 50 years, and men's real wages have been falling for 70 years. For the whole country, not just people without a BA, life expectancy at birth fell from 2014 to 2017. And that's the first time there's been 3 years of declining life expectancy since the last pandemic in 1918, 1919. And of course, what's happening now is not going to be very good for life expectancy either. So what we identified as the most rapidly rising causes of death were what we came to call deaths of despair: drug overdoses, alcohol-related mortality, and suicide. All of those are, in a sense, self-inflicted. They're not due to a virus or bacterium, not due to medical errors. They're socially related causes of death. Remarkably, none of this is happening for people with a 4-year university degree. There's signs of something similar, if on a much smaller scale, in Britain, especially in Scotland. Not so much in continental Europe, though there's a little in other English-speaking countries like Ireland and Canada. Here is the cover of our book, which came out a couple of months ago, and my co-author, Ann Case, and this rather spectacularly horrible cover, which looks like a tombstone. Let me show you some of the numbers these are the 3 causes of death, the deaths of despair that I identified. Those are for US white non-Hispanics aged 50 to 54, which is the sort of epicenter of this, but I'll show you some other ages in a minute. And this graph goes from 1992 up to 2016, and they're separated, the red lines for people without a BA, and the blue lines for people with a 4-year college degree. The panels are for drug overdoses, for suicides, and for alcoholic liver disease. And what you can see is this remarkable, these are deaths per 100,000, which is the standard way in which these things are measured. And you can see this very rapid increase for those without a BA, and a little bit, but not very much, for those with a BA or more. So this 4-year college degree has become a meaningful dividing line, and the fraction with a BA has changed little since the birth cohort of 1945. Somewhat surprising that many more people are trying to go to college, but not all that many people are coming within a BA, at least for this cohort. And so this has become a really hard division in American society between these two things. So just to show what's happening to other ages, these are the three deaths of despair taken together: drug, alcohol, and suicide mortality, and they're for 5-year age groups. And what you can see is it's happening everywhere. And the BA, non-BA divide is there everywhere. These graphs actually go up to 2018, and there's been a little tick back in 2018, likely to be reversed in 2019. And you can see the only people who are sort of exempt for this are the elderly, people aged 65 and above. And this is something that's happening in middle age and is working its way back to younger and younger cohorts. I wanted to devote a slide to talking about Michael Young, the sort of British eccentric and genius who finished up as a lord, I think. And in fact, he spent most of his life denouncing the aristocracy, and the story was he accepted a baronetcy simply so that he could get the expenses to travel to London and go to the House of Lords. In his book, in which he was the first to use the word meritocracy, and it was written in 1958, and he saw meritocracy as a terrible dystopia in which there were two classes dividing the country, and presciently, the whole thing is incredibly prescient. He called them the populists on the one hand and the hypocrisy on the other hand. The term populist, more familiar today. Hypocrisy is probably something that should be used more than it is. And he talks about the educated elite, which is self-satisfied. Of course, it got there by passing exams, so it attributes its success to all their own effort, and very little sympathy for those who had their chance but failed. The terms equality of opportunity is their credo. And most of us respond pretty positively to the term equality of opportunity. Well, the answer is you shouldn't, because it's become almost a badge of dishonor. So for the 2/3 of the US without a BA, they, on the other hand, they believe the system is rigged, but they also have a sneaking suspicion that it's their own fault for being there. And this generates an incredibly volatile and unpleasant social mix, which we're seeing in America with sort of Trump voters, which you saw in Britain over Brexit. And there's been these people are essentially politically unrepresented. And this is something I much like. I mean, Clem Attlee's 1945 cabinet had 7 men who started life at the coalface. Nowadays, there are very few people in Parliament or in Congress in the US who do not have a BA. You have 15% in the UK, which is actually higher than the only 6% in the US who do not have a college degree. So these people are essentially not represented anymore. And one of Young's favorite terms was the populists have given up their gifted children to the enemy. And there's no more effective way of gutting a social order than handing your gifted children over to the enemy. And that's what's happened. That is a wonderful book, and it's almost a Bible for today. All right, so here we have this very volatile political and health situation already. And into this comes COVID-19. So there's not a perfect alignment, but it's pretty clear that those suffering the deaths of despair get to suffer all over again. And many of these people who are less educated, they're either essential workers, in which case they work, they drive the trains, they drive the subway, they drive the buses, they work in the supermarkets, they work in essential retail and risk their lives, or they work workers in nursing homes, for instance, in the US, of which an enormous number have died, or they're not essential, in which case many non-essential retail workers, for instance, and they risk their livelihoods depending on policy. So, it depends how unemployment benefits are paid or whether the British scheme or the American scheme. But they're okay right now up until the end of July, but it's not clear how much further it would go on than that. The educated elite do not risk their lives or their livelihoods. So you got this situation in which you're taking this elite group, you're not doing anything to their health or incomes because you're being held constant, and you take the less educated group and you're threatening both their health and both their incomes. And it sure is going to widen the differentials, the health inequalities and income differentials. The differential, this usually stuns people, but the difference in wages, earnings between people with and without a four-year degree in the US is currently 80%, much higher than it used to be. Also big wealth differentials. I said that Friday, and as we shelter at home, we watch the stock market rise, which is one of the more astonishing things of this episode. That every time there's a bad news, every time there's a riot, every time someone gets shot, the stock market seems to go up another 500 points. And I'll come back to talking about that. But our retirement portfolios are certainly not being threatened to the extent they're in the stock market. Now, just to make it clear, the match is not perfect. The less educated white non-Hispanics that have been suffering the deaths of despair. There are clearly some high-skilled people at risk, doctors, for instance, many people in the health sector. There's also excess mortality among Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans in huge numbers in the US. Much of this in the US seems to be linked to both occupation and residential segregation. For instance, it's clear that in New York, many of the people caught the COVID on the subway because they were commuting from the segregated areas in which they live into downtown Manhattan, and you could track the outbreaks along the subway lines. Of course, as many people have said, this COVID is sort of, it's like an X-ray. It's lighting up previously existing inequalities that we knew were there, but we didn't know they were as important as they are. And of course, many people are drawing the link between that and recent social unrest with people who've had their jobs taken away, who are threatened with the virus. They've had a lot of their entertainment taken away. Restaurants are closed. Sports, I think, which is a much under talked about thing, I think is incredibly important. It holds people together in America, and that social glue has been sort of removed. So Paul Farmer, I think it was, who said existing inequalities structure how the infection spread. It's like residential segregation, as well as who is likely to die. In the UK, I was reading the Public Health Report yesterday, very strong link between COVID infection and deprivation, as well as with racial disaggregation. The pandemic has also further highlighted the dysfunction of American healthcare system, which is tied to, it should say tied to employment, or insurance is tied to employment, and many with insurance are inadequately covered. So even if you have coverage, you're going to be finishing up with large bills, and many people who had coverage don't have it anymore because they lost their job. And of course, I don't have time to talk about this today, but these splits are much, much worse, much more serious in poorer countries, as in India, for example. So let me say a few words about the post-COVID world. And this is, of course, very speculative, but it seems to me that unemployment is unlikely to recover completely for a long time because many pre-existing businesses will not reopen. Many businesses will operate differently. There'll be more infection proofing, probably fewer employees. Huge advantage for electronic everything. And of course, that favors the more educated over the less educated. There's been a huge consolidation that was already going on. With many hospitals failing, being taken over by bigger hospitals, many businesses failing. Amazon is doing very well, not as well as it had hoped to, and private equity is clearly seeing opportunities now. You could regard these people as vultures, or you could regard them as rescuing firms, which otherwise would go belly up, and you can take your own view on that. This, I think, is really, though it's very hard to tell this story without thinking of capital being further favored relative to labor. The capital share, which used to be thought to be one of the great constants in the world, has been rising. This will lead to a further rise in it and a further widening of inequality. That rise in the capital share is not the only reason the stock market is so high, but it's certainly one of them. The widening of inequalities, though inequality is already historically high, And that, I suspect, will happen both within and between countries. And if you think, many times in the past, writers have said, well, if inequality would go up anymore, we'll have a complete breakdown of society. And the inequality went up and there was no breakdown of society, and that's happened in many countries over and over again. Maybe this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. On the other hand, we got this so wrong in the past, maybe it'll be wrong still. But it's hard to think of much more inequality than there already is. There'll be some pullback on hyperglobalization. The way I like to think of this is our public policy portfolio will have more safety in it, but less growth, even though growth was anemic already. Health, I'm going to finish by talking about health in the post-pandemic world. So in the US, we have this idea that the healthcare system will come out as this as a hero, and everybody will think that's great, and no one will be able to touch it, and it'll get even worse in terms of exploiting people than it does now. On the other hand, it could be that they overreach and they do badly, and they're seen to have done badly, in which case there's real chance of very serious reform and cost control. The virus may be around for a long time, so higher mortality rates for a long time, even if much less than at the peak of the epidemic. And it really does mean the days of steadily improving life expectancy in the rich world are almost certainly gone. They were faltering anyway. There's not been much increase in life expectancy in Britain in the last few years, and it's been declining here. Some good things that might come out of it is greater weight given to public health, and maybe a greater respect for science and expertise more generally. So that some of the people who've come out of the emergency in the US, the best are some of the public health officials, like Anthony Fauci, for instance, a well-known to some of us, but publicly generally obscure official who's become a great hero of this episode and is widely trusted. So let me end by talking about this argument that the lockdown in particular and unemployment that's to come, possibly something like mass unemployment, could actually increase deaths of despair. And it's a very simple idea that, the deaths of despair that we talk about in our book have really come about through a long-term deterioration in the labor market, which has made it harder to get married, harder to maintain marriages, it's undermined communities and so on. So couldn't we say, okay, if you have mass unemployment, we're going to get that, but get it in spades, as it were. And we think that's probably not the case. And let me go a little bit through the argument. There's little to link over the past 25 years between unemployment in the US and deaths of despair. It's true that suicides are often higher with unemployment. And we all think of unemployment as one of the worst things that can happen to someone. It makes them very unhappy, and it might even cause them to despair. President Trump and Health Secretary Azar have been arguing for this as an argument for widespread opening. And let me show you some of the pictures of this. So here's what happened. Here's the unemployment rate in the US over the last 50 years. Or so. And the solid black line is the age-adjusted suicide rate, and the dotted line is the unemployment rate. And at first it's sort of impressive. It's high at one end, they're both high, they go down in the middle and then come back up again. But if you look in detail, it's not so impressive at all. I mean, one is there was this big recession in 1981, which didn't do anything to suicide at all. And most remarkably is the Great Recession, which many people have been arguing has been causing a great deal of suicide and unhappiness. But you can see it's true that as the unemployment rate went up, the suicide rate went up. But then when unemployment came down, the suicide rate went up even faster. So it's sort of hard to argue that an increase in unemployment further will make the suicide rate go up. They just don't seem to be very well connected, at least right now. You could use the Great Depression as some sort of example of this. And, we all heard the stories of people jumping out of skyscrapers on Black Monday in New York. And once again, there's this huge peak of unemployment here in 1935, 31, sorry, not 35, and a peak in suicides too, but there was a big peak in suicides, in 1910. And the suicides were rising very rapidly long before the economy collapsed. So this is not a simple story, and we really think it'd have to be qualified in some serious way to make it good. So let me summarize, and this is my last slide. High unemployment may bring some suicides as people lose meaning and structure in their lives. I don't want to go too far with this. The Great Recession doesn't work for the US, as you just saw. The Great Depression sort of works, but the timing is far from perfect. But maybe the US is really different here. So one of the things that's really true in the US and terrific is that suicide rates have been falling in essentially every country in the world. Even in China and even in the country Russia and the countries of the former Soviet Union. And the US is the startling exception to that fact. I mean, something's really going wrong in the US. So maybe other countries look better, but I looked at the UK and we have suicide data back into the 19th century. It had peak suicides in 1935 in the Great Depression, but the peak was the same size as the peak in 1910, where there was no Great Recession. And there are very sharp dips in World War I and World War II. And that's actually important because if governments can bring us together during this crisis and make it seem like a wartime event, you know, and I watched the Queen talking about her first broadcast 60 years before and explicitly appealing to that sense of solidarity in wartime against the virus. And if that succeeds, suicides could go very much the other way. Since 1990 in the UK, there's been a slow decline in suicides, but it's been flat since 2007, possibly linked to recession and austerity. But that's a hard line to draw too, because most of the increase has been in Wales and Scotland, and not so much in England. So I don't think there's much evidence to support a major concern about suicide and unemployment. And many other kinds of death decline when economic activity is low, like road traffic, and commuting might be down for a long time as people discover how much they like Zoom for some things at least. And that will save a lot of lives too. So I think there's lots to worry about in the post-COVID world. I think inequality will be worse. I don't think our health will be better, but I don't think we should scare ourselves with thinking about there being hundreds of thousands of suicides. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn off my screen sharing and hand back to Creon.
Well, thank you very much. An enormous amount there. Just to remind everybody that if you'd like to pose a question, if you could put that into the Q&A function, and just while everybody's thinking a little bit about the questions they want to ask and posting them there, I'd just like to ask one myself, which actually goes back to your original work with Anne Case, which is, I mean, one of the most striking things is how decisive college education is in separating two groups, essentially. And obviously, one possibility is that this is something about college education, that it gives you various kinds of skills and abilities and so on. But it's also possible that people who, you know, are set for a certain, you know, positive life are the ones who choose college education. And so I just wonder to what, I know this is something I think in your book you explore further, but to what extent is college education actually something that in itself makes the difference? Or to what extent is it a kind of something that people who have the underlying ability to make a real success of their life choose to do?
Yes, I'm sure there's some component of it that way. And, you know, that's a very old debate in education, whether we're actually adding any value to these kids or whether we're just selecting the smartest ones. And, you know, we're not actually doing very much. And even those of us who spent our lives in the sector would probably not care to answer that question in general. You know, we clearly do add value sometimes, but we're also, if you teach at a place like Princeton or Cambridge or Bristol, where I taught before, you're selecting very smart kids and putting labels on them. But I think it's gone way beyond that. So I think it has become the mark of social stratification, and it's sort of replaced the class system by education. And one of the things about that's interesting is even the differences between blacks and whites have become as much a matter of education as a matter of race, for example. So blacks with a BA now, and many indicators do as well, or even better than whites with a BA. The issue is, of course, that very few blacks get to go to college relative to whites, and so that's a problem. But we seem to be using this as a meritocratic marker rather than as something that's really, really fun.
And I mean, in terms of the public policy implication, I mean, some people would argue that you need, they could look at your work and say, well, we need a new GI Bill or something of that kind, which sort of massively increases the number of people who have access to this kind of education. I mean, what would your view be on that as a partial, not a complete, but a partial solution to the trends you've identified?
Yeah, I mean, I think something like a GI Bill would be a good idea. But it's not going to solve this widespread problem. But part of the other thing that we have, and I didn't really talk about, is one of the reasons that education has become so expensive is because of the cost of healthcare. So state governments who pay for state universities, which have been a major ladder upwards, have been so strangled by what they have to pay for Medicaid that they've been cutting their budgets on these once great universities that have become more like private universities, more exclusive. So I'm in favor of something like a GI Bill if it would enable more people to go to college that are currently excluded because of the high cost of college. That said, I mean, we need an educational system that does something for the 2/3 that don't go to college, right? Because it's a terrible waste of resources. I mean, from day one, from kindergarten, everything is trained up. And I know that's true in Britain too. I remember a next door neighbor in Cambridge, worrying that her 4-year-old grandchild wasn't going to get into Cambridge because he'd screwed up the kindergarten entrance exams or something, So that there's this ladder which you're supposed to get on very, very early. But we're not doing very much along that ladder to prepare people for useful widespread careers. And I think that's the answer to this meritocracy problem, is not to divide ourselves in this way and to valorize lots of other occupations and activities. I think they do a better job of that in Germany than they do in the US, but I think Britain is going more like the US sort of way.
Yeah. So we have a number of questions coming in, and one of the questions is really about looking forward to the extent to which households in the US are prepared for the coming shock, and in particular, I guess following the financial crisis, to what extent did people deleverage and so on. But to what extent do you think people are prepared, and to what extent can they do more to prepare for what's coming, or is it in a sense too late?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, so much depends on how long this goes on for, and that's something we don't know very much about right now. It's very hard to expect people to save, for example, to buffer themselves against something like this, where they have no idea how long it's going to go on for. And a lot will depend on government response and how long it's prepared to keep people. And a lot will depend on the course of the pandemic and whether we get another huge second wave, or whether, which I think is more likely, we get a lot of local epidemics, which would be more easily controlled. So I think it's really a lot of it's how people run businesses, and how they can infection-proof businesses on the supposition this is going to be around for a long time. And people are apparently saving rather a lot, simply because, I look at my credit card bill and there's nothing on it, and I think that's true for a lot of people. But it's not going to be enough to tide them over, I think, without government help or without a fairly rapid reopening of the economy.
And we have a number of, I think, a number of questions about, you've obviously focused very much on the US and the experiences in the US, but you have sort of made some observations about the extent to which the same trends are in the UK and in Europe. And there's a question about the Scandinavian countries, which clearly have if you like, a social system right at the other end of the spectrum to the one you find in the US, both in terms of healthcare, but the quality of public services and so on. So, to what extent do you think that provides if one adopted all those set of policies, would that solve this problem? Or is there still, issues in those countries as well, which are similar to the ones you've identified?
Right. Well, I think I've been surprised. I mean, I'm working with IFS on this review. And so I've been doing my own thing more in the UK and the US, but they've been doing a lot of really good work, and they have a COVID page, and a lot of the things I talked about here today have their parallels in the UK. So that, for instance, the racial composition of deaths, for instance, is different but parallel. Like the minorities have done much worse than they ought to have done. So that's very much the same. Also, the balance of people between essential and non-essential workers, or whatever you call them, is very similar. That, you know, women plus less educated people and so on are the people who are putting their lives at risk. And also, depending on how these arrangements pan out, their livelihoods are potentially at risk too. So those things seem very common. It's also true that, you know, I would not blame any country for a failure to deal with this well. I mean, I just think it was, nothing like this has happened for 100 years. There are many people who are saying, we've been telling you for years this was going to happen. But there were arguments against that too. And I didn't think it was going to happen, for instance. And I spent a lot of time thinking about pandemics and health, and I was wrong. So I just, the fact that, and you know, I would not blame the American healthcare system for preventing this from happening any more than Americans should be blaming the national healthcare system for saying, or the national health for claiming that, you know, they caused a pandemic sort of idea. So I don't blame that. I think what will happen ex post is very different, since I think there's going to be chaos in America as people try to pay for this. And paradoxically, huge numbers of hospitals in America have closed, and many nurses are out of work and many doctors are out of work because of the close down of non-essential services. So that's a mess, and it's going to be a big mess to sort out here. I'm very much in favor of better safety nets than we have here. One of the major ones of those, again, is having a healthcare system that is not tied to employment. And, you know, if the COVID takes that away and has a more reasonable system, of which there are many to choose from. You don't have to have the government run the healthcare system. There's lots of ways of doing that. But almost anything would be better than what we have right now here. I think the politics, one of the things that's very different here is the political division between right and left, which I don't think is true in Europe to the same extent. And it's partly to do with the geography and the fact that all the people who are dying in democratic controlled states. And, you know, that makes it really, really hard, because if you're the governor of a state like Montana, where there have been fewer deaths in Montana than there have been in Princeton, New Jersey, you know, and no one's died for a week, why should you be having 17% unemployment rate or something? So that has made the politics of it very, very hard. And I don't think you have that in Europe, but that's a genuine difference between the two countries, not...
Yeah, indeed. I think, I mean, there's a number of questions really about, I think, picking up on the comments you made around asset prices and the fact that so far, at least, despite this, the underlying trends as it affects different income groups, at least as far as asset prices, these are you know, come back remarkably sharply. And I don't know if you'd like to, I mean, the questions are about, you know, is the Fed stimulus at risk of creating a bubble in asset markets? There's questions about the extent to which, you know, there will be if you like, a risk-off situation in the future, and then a sudden reversal, things of that kind. I don't know if you would like to say something about your view as to the risks arising from the, if you like, the current policy mix for financial markets, and how that then might impact on this underlying trend that you've identified.
Yeah, I'm not the best person to talk about the Fed response and so on. But I mean, I think these very large miscalled stimulus packages, because they're not stimulus packages, they're relief packages, make a lot of sense. And the difficulty is going to be how we sort out the wreckage after that. And that's going to call for maybe more wisdom than American politicians have. I don't know. But the stock market does worry me because, when you watch the evening news and it's a litany of riots and COVID deaths, and then they say the stock market went up by another 500 points today, it makes me very angry. And I think it makes a lot of other people very angry who feel that they're suffering while the plutocrats are benefiting. And, I think a lot of it is just to do with the fact that interest rates are essentially zero, which means there's nowhere else to put any assets. And so if you sell your portfolio in the stock market, what are you going to do with it? And that's obviously, really a big part of the story. And I think the Fed should be very loose right now because you need to have small businesses find it easy. So I think all of that is good. Dealing with the aftermath is much harder. But of course, the stock market is the present discounted value of future profits. And so if workers are killed off or there's mass unemployment, the stock market benefits from that. And that's the bit of it that can make you angry if you start thinking about that. Even while I sit here and watch my retirement portfolio not suffer.
So you feel that is one of the, that could be one of the reasons that the stock market is relatively strong. It's its assumptions about what could happen to the future welfare spending and things of that kind. I mean, that seems extraordinary. I may have misunderstood what you meant, but do you think
that's what I mean. And also I think this something that many of us have been worrying about for a long time, which is the consolidation of industry. And big tech is connected with that. And there's a large debate in economics right now about whether we just simply failed to enforce antitrust, and there are people on both sides of that issue. I mean, it's a serious debate, but this is going to make those concerns much worse. Because you have something like Amazon and Walmart that have these terrific online service things that can deliver stuff. And, they're in a situation where 90% of their competitors have been closed down while the government ensures that their customers have enough money to go on spending. And it's just like paradise for those guys. And, the stock market should go up based on that. But it's making a lot of the rest of us very uncomfortable as to how we're going to face an industrial landscape where there's much more dominance of large firms or large hospitals or whatever, even than there was before, and we were worried about it before.
I mean, it raises a further question that, given this sort of depressing picture in the policy space, if one wants to sort of, if for example, there were a change in this administration and you had, a democratic administration with a different approach coming in, but recognizing that you can't do everything to tackle these issues at one go, what would be for you the priorities for a new administration in trying to sort of reverse course from what we've seen over the last 20, 30 years that you've been looking at this worsening situation?
Yeah, well, what Ann and I argue in our book, and this is really going back pre-COVID, there's going to be a lot of tidying up of wreckage, but that apart. And that may occupy a new administration for about all the energy that it has. But, the healthcare system in the US would be the first thing I would go, because everybody and everywhere in the world, less educated workers, or everywhere in the rich world, there's a real threat to less educated workers. And that's true in Britain as it is here. But it's only here that you're getting these deaths of despair. And we tie a lot of that to the fact that making people pay $10,000 or $20,000 essentially out of their wages when you're a less educated worker just destroys jobs. It's like taking a wrecking ball to the labor market. I would also rein in the pharma companies who've been poisoning people for profit in a way that's not allowed in Europe, for example. So we have these two peculiar American dysfunctions, which, and they're not the only things. I mean, automation and globalization are important and difficult, but this is something we can do about. This is a self-inflicted wound. And for me, at least in the US, that's the most important policy to do. In Britain, you're going to have different concerns, but I think doing something about low-wage labor markets and zero-hours contract and all the people who are suffering as a result of this technical change is something you're going to have to face.
Yeah. And I guess the related question is, given that COVID-19 is a health crisis, so notwithstanding the fact that health has always been such a tricky issue to bring about policy change in the US, could this be an upside from COVID-19, that actually this might be the one thing that enables a substantial change?
Yeah, we've been hoping for that.
Yeah.
The danger is, and many people, many wise people over the years will say it will take some terrible event to break this because they're so politically powerful. They have 5 lobbyists in Washington for every member of Congress. They've got a large number of politicians on both sides of the aisle who are very close to work for them. So we're going to take a major catastrophe. The trouble with major catastrophes is they have very unpredictable consequences. And people keep saying to us, well, the 30s were pretty bad, and it worked for America. You got Roosevelt, but it didn't work so well in Germany, for example. So, it's always dangerous. It makes us very nervous. But yes, I think there is a chance.
Well, unfortunately, we're sort of running through our time, but there was one final question, if I could put this to you, that came from one of our members watching, and it's really around, you've focused on the, in the sense that unemployment is not closely related with the suicide rate. So the question is, what is, in a way, could it be income inequality? Could it be, the demographics of the population? I don't know if in looking at that, you've also looked at that, what could be the underlying factors?
Well, actually, we were thinking about suicide when we first discovered the deaths of despair. So it was the way we got into this issue. And I think suicide does respond to economic change in the long run, not so much in the short run. And Durkheim thought that economic upheaval, even if it was positive, would cause suicide because it unmoors people from the familiar surroundings in which they're living and the things on which their lives depend. So there's been a long-term decline in old age suicide in the US, much of which has had to do with care and with better pensions and so on. So I think that sort of social policy works in the long run. And I do think, destroying the lifestyle of the working class, which has taken the meaning out of their lives, has caused this increase in suicides in middle age. I don't think there's much in the short run. I'm sure unemployment has a small effect, but has some effect. I'm prepared to believe that. But it really, and it's also a very mysterious thing. It's not clear when you read the suicide literature that we've made a lot of progress since Durkheim 120 years ago. Yeah.
Do you think it could be the perception of inequality itself? That people are aware of inequality, and in a way, that is one of the things that...
I've never bought that argument because it doesn't discriminate between poor people and rich people. If I do really well on the stock market, that increases inequality, and it doesn't make me want to go kill myself at all. So I think you have to go beyond inequality to look at the texture of it and who's being hurt, whose lives are coming apart, and whose lives are not coming apart. Yeah. And I do think the widespread spread in inequality is indeed making people's lives more different and is difficult and is causing more people whose lives have lost their meaning and so on. So I see inequality as being a symptom of this disease that is causing people to kill themselves at the same time, rather than the cause.
Well, Professor Deaton, thank you so much. I'd like to thank everybody for all their questions and for their participation, but particularly you, Professor Deaton, for a really fascinating presentation and for answering these questions. And hopefully we'll be seeing you again soon on another Chatham House event. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. It's been good.
Thank you.